This is Virginia Peterson, and we're about to begin the third of a series of discussions with Dr. Ashley Montagu, the well-known anthropologist, on the nature of human nature. Dr. Montagu, in our last talk, you stated in effect that the influence of the outside world on the human being actually begins with his conception. I'd like to turn now to what appears to me a highly controversial idea of yours, that this human child is born not grasping, egotistical, or social, as we've usually believed, but on the contrary, a loving and cooperative creature already.
I think this is a very important idea and is well worth dealing with in some detail. I remember when I was a student many years ago of psychology, I was given a textbook on the fourth page of which I was shown a photograph of a newborn baby who was supporting himself by his own arms from a horizontal bar. And I wondered what this was doing in a textbook on psychology, and I soon found out that this was supposed to be an evidence of the fact that man is descended from apes or monkeys who can do the same sort of thing, you see, and therefore was it not a logical conclusion to draw from this that if man carries within his own structure the ability to support himself by overarm, a brachiation as the technical term has it, that he also carries within his own structure the psychic stigmata of his relationship to these ferocious, nasty, brutal beasts. And the idea, of course, was that he certainly does, because has not our whole tradition told us, the Judeo-Christian tradition through the Pauline version, the doctrine of original sin, that man is nasty, brutish, selfish in the flesh, the whole of the 1900 years or more that have elapsed since the Pauline version of man's nature was given to the world, in every way served to corroborate this notion. Then in 1651 we have Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan asserting that the life of man in a state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, and that it really isn't fundamentally any different in the state of society. Then, of course, this is followed by the tradition of the Darwinian evolutionists, who asserted that in the struggle for life there is an internecine competition and warfare of a combative kind between animals in which the weakest go to the wall and the strongest survive and leave a progeny to carry on their own traits. This tradition was finally capped by the most insightful of all the students of the human psyche, Sigmund Freud, who, in psychoanalytic theory, stated that man's behavior could be explained as the result of the interaction of two principal instinctive drives: the drive toward love, eros, and the drive toward death, or thanatos. He stated quite clearly that from his point of view the goose was cooked, because he was very much afraid that the hostile, aggressive, naughty, brattish impulses, the death instinct, the death drive, was conquering the love instinct, and man had really no future.
Are you about to say that all of these people are wrong and
Yes.
all of these theories are empty?
Not only about to say, but to assert with all the positiveness that I can muster to this occasion that this whole tradition is entirely wrong, and furthermore, to challenge the whole world to produce a single iota of evidence which would withstand a moment's critical examination in the light of the facts, which in any way could support these traditions.
Well, then the child is born, as you said before, with certain influences already on it from the outside and with its genes, its potentialities. But all these potentialities are good ones?
Yes, entirely good. And the reason for this is simple to understand, because this creature that has been so interdependent with its mother for these 266 and a half days in the womb, at birth is ready for the development which is to prepare him for life outside the womb in the postnatal world. Now, to pause in parenthesis, there are quite a number of so-called primitive people, non-literate people, who recognize these facts and who recognize that the outside world is simply an extension of the inside world, and they frequently refer to the outside world as an extension of the womb. They put it very poetically, and they say the family is the immediate extension of the womb, and then the community, which is an extension of the family, which is an extension of the womb, and then the tribe, and then all tribes, as it were, all nations together.
But you would concede that the temperature is slightly different.
Oh, yes, the temperature and the pressure, particularly the pressure. And to return now to my assertion that all human beings are born good.
Is it not a flat contradiction of the entire experience of mankind?
I think I could agree with you if you would modify it and say, is it not a flat contradiction of almost the entire experience? And the answer would be yes, it is a flat contradiction of almost the entire experience of mankind, that vast numbers of human beings have, I think, on the basis of such evidence as was available to them, quite rightly, drawn the conclusion that man must be a nasty brat. After all, how can you explain these wars, these delinquencies, these internecine conflicts, these inhumanities of man toward man? After all, we've just gone through a period where the Nazis exterminated millions of innocent human beings. And this is not in the days of Attila the Hun, but right in the 20th century. How otherwise can you account for such phenomena without resorting to the final arbiter, namely the innate qualities of man? Now, apropos of this, I would point out what John Stuart Mill said in this connection. This is the most vulgar of errors committed by human beings when they can't find a solution for any form of human behavior, is to attribute it to innate factors, because if it's innate, then you escape all sorts of necessary examination. That is the explanation.
Is this not a slight oversimplification of what most people today believe, which is that the child is born with potentialities for good and for evil, and that it depends on the environment and the influences brought to bear on the child early on, whether the evil emerges or is disciplined and held down? Seems to me that's a far more logical conclusion.
Yes, this sounds perfectly reasonable, and indeed is a reasonable idea, but it just doesn't happen to be true, because man doesn't have any kind of equipment which is evil in any way and which will emerge if the proper conditions and stimuli are provided. On the other hand, the evil that we believe emerges from men is actually produced in them by their teachers, their socializers.
Artificially inculcated?
Certainly. Take, for example, the matter of aggression. We say this little boy is a nasty brat. He pushes little boys and girls around. He tears things up. He breaks things. He throws things around. He's a real problem. Now, this chap is behaving in a manner which suggests that there is something in him which is causing him to do this. Well, the truth is that there is something in him, but the question is whether it was born in him or whether this was produced in him by the kind of experience he was made to undergo. But a child, when it pushes or tears or breaks, isn't necessarily being aggressive. He may be simply experimenting with the world. He may be exhibiting his curiosity and asking himself, what happens when I do this? He may be completely unaware of any hostility in the act, and there may be none in it.
Or just satisfying a need for something that belongs to somebody else?
Yes, quite. Without realizing that there are such things as property rights, something which he has to learn. But you see, a child, when he wants something and has his want satisfied as a small infant, as a baby, and then as a young child, generally doesn't in any way feel that he is being deprived of anything or that he must in any way behave in a hostile manner toward another. On the other hand, if he has been deprived of satisfactions which he has been expecting, then what he begins to feel is at first disappointment. For example, as a small infant, he is lying in his crib and he wants some milk. And no one realizes that he wants it. He smacks his lip, he puts his tongue out, moves his fingers on the palms of his hand, and thus attempts to attract attention. We don't understand this, so we don't pay attention. Then he becomes increasingly more disappointed and eventually quite distressed, and he begins to cry. When he cries, we rush over to him, pick him up, see whether there are pins sticking into him or whether his diapers need changing, and then if he continues to cry, we may give him a bottle or its equivalent. after several such experiences, says to himself with the aha effect, aha, these dopes don't understand babies at all. Anytime I want anything, I don't have to attempt to communicate in the ordinary way with them. All I have to do is to cry. And so he cries, and this is the way we teach children to cry when they need anything. We condition them to cry. Now, if we don't attend to his needs when he cries, he will become frustrated. A frustration is defined as the thwarting of an expected satisfaction. When he is born, he behaves as if the whole world were designed to minister to his needs. If the world does not minister to his needs, he is disappointed, he is thwarted. A thwarted expectation is a frustration. Now, if you frustrate him, he eventually will accumulate a sufficient number of frustrations to begin to be the crier, the compeller of other people's attention.
But are you saying that he simply has needs that must be satisfied when he's born, nothing else? Or are you saying that with these needs he has love and cooperation? Because if you just say he has needs, that isn't defying any previous notions. We all accept that babies have needs that must be satisfied. But where does the love and the cooperation come in?
Well, let me finish this point and return to the answer to your question. Where do the needs and where does the love and where does the cooperation come in? He expects to be loved. He expects his needs to be satisfied. But if you don't satisfy his needs, you frustrate him. If you frustrate him, what you've simply done is you've caused him to resort to a means of compelling your love, of compelling your attention, by causing him to cry, to exhibit behavior in muscular ways. He clench his little fists and turn red and blue in the face, etc., and yell at the top of his voice. And we say, you see, there it is. There's the brute in him, the little devil, the little egomaniac, a little egocentric, selfish, monomaniacal creature that he is born as.
Well, isn't it egocentric to expect your needs to be filled?
No, on the other hand, it is egocentric of you to go about your own business, not attending to the needs of this creature who is entirely dependent upon you and who is designed to be dependent upon you. It's his birthright to expect you responsibly to minister to his needs. Otherwise, you had no right to bring him into existence.
Well, are all needs the same? Are there not some human beings born with exaggerated needs? Are they all equal when the child is born?
More or less all equal for practical purposes. The needs are more or less similar in all human beings. Now, when you frustrate this baby's need, what you've done is simply to frustrate his need for love. And what he is searching for in this behavior, which we call aggression, is love. In other words, aggressive behavior is love frustrated. And every time you see aggressive behavior, you can bet your rock-bottom dollar that this is an individual who is in need of love, and that his aggressive behavior is calculated to compel your love. He wants your attention. Every time you go into a police court where some juvenile delinquents are being brought in, observe how they behave in relation to the photographer. They immediately jockey with each other for positions, begin spitting on their hands, smoothing down their hair.
But that isn't love.
No, but they want attention, and the reason they're in the gang, and the reason why they've become juvenile delinquents is usually, if not always, because there has been a failure of love on the part of those individuals who should have been giving them love. Now, this is aggression. Aggression is love frustrated, and wherever you see it in an individual, you can be pretty certain that this is what they're signaling for. Not only a baby, a child, but an adult.
This is a purely psychoanalytic theory, is it not?
No, don't call it any theory other than a statement of the fact. These are the observed facts. Furthermore, we observe that small children, up to the age of 2 years or even beyond, in their aggressive behavior that pushes others around or whatnot, have no content of hostility in the behavior at all. Aggression is behavior calculated to inflict pain or injury upon another. They don't have this until they learn it. And they learn it from adults who they have observed inflicting pain or injury upon others, or the children themselves have been the subjects of the pain and injury that have been inflicted upon them by others.
In a happy family where the parents are devoted to the children and there are what are called siblings by psychoanalysts, are there not quarrels among siblings designed to hurt each other? Do they arise from any pattern, or don't they arise spontaneously from one wanting something the other one also wants?
Oh, this certainly can happen, but it's not something that they have dredged up from their interiors as part of their innate response system. But on the other hand, this is something that they have previously experienced, and having experienced, now visit upon another. I've even heard the ridiculous statements made again and again. You see this child, you see the way he is attacking that old grandfather clock and taking it to pieces, or he's pulling the wings off beautiful butterflies, etc. You see, this is his hostility, his innate aggression, his evil. This is rubbish, this is nonsense. This is his curiosity expressing itself. He just wants to see how things work by taking them apart and even attempting to put them together again. He's frequently devilishly disappointed.
What evidence is there to support your theory, Dr. Montagu, that aggression is not a matter of instinct but of education?
The best study that I know of to date that has been made on the hostility and aggression of children is that made by Robert Sears and his co-workers. Robert Sears is professor of psychology at Stanford University at the present time, and this is a study on the development of aggressive behavior in children. And it is on the basis of his observations and that of students of children like Dr. Loretta Bender of Bellevue Hospital Medical College, who is professor of psychiatry and a specialist in the psychiatry of children, through whose hands literally thousands of children have passed. She has written this down in her book on aggression and hostility in children, that she has never known a child who was innately aggressive and has never known a child in whom the aggression could not be traced to parents or whoever else participated in the children's education.
Well, if all evil is educated into someone and is not there in the first place, how can there be a capacity, a child born with capacity, only in one direction?
Because the direction of human development has been, through the whole evolution of man, in the direction of greater and greater cooperativeness. And this is the point at which I think we have to get back to the process of birth. Here is the child who has spent his 266 and a half days in the womb, about to get born. Now, certain changes take place. For example, the amount of progesterone, a hormone largely in the latter part of pregnancy secreted by the placenta, which is a temporary endocrine gland, begins to stop secreting progesterone. The oxygen content of the blood of the fetus begins to go down, and the uterus begins to contract, and the fetus begins to be expelled into the external world. He is crashed against the bony walls of his mother's pelvis. He frequently develops an edematous swelling on the top of his head called the caput succedinum as a result of this knocking around. He is attempting a tremendous number of sensory impulses coming into him. In other words, he's being stimulated, but he is so cramped in the womb, he's quite large, you see, at this time, and he cannot move properly, and therefore he builds up a tremendous amount of unexpended motor energy in attempting to respond to these stimuli, but being prevented by the uterine walls, and he really has a quite difficult time. This has given rise to the theory, associated with the name of Otto Rank in psychoanalytic circles, that every birth is a traumatic experience. Now, we do have evidence, in spite of the fact that this theory of the trauma of birth was kicked around for many years, and because there was no evidence one way or the other, most people forgot about it or mentioned it as an interesting theory. But the evidence that we've accumulated in recent years from non-psychological but physiological, obstetrical, and other sources tends to support the notion that indeed the birth process is an extremely traumatic experience for the normally born human being, and that indeed it is a highly desirable experience to go through.
By traumatic, you mean a shocking experience?
A shocking experience, yes. An injurious experience, and injurious in the sense that certain abnormal changes are produced in the life of the fetus, which subsequently become part of the normal structure and development of the fetus. Now, by injurious, I mean this infant who is then so equilibrious, if we may coin a term, time in the mother's womb, undergoes changes in his circulation, which are for the fetus abnormal. For example, most of the blood in the fetus was manufactured by the fetus himself. He didn't get any from mother. It came, for the most part, from his bone marrow. He has no circulation of anything resembling the kind that he is subsequently going to have. The blood comes into his circulation in such a way that none of it, for example, passes into his lungs. His lungs are inactive. But the moment he is born, he is now dependent upon a blood manufacturing system which is dependent upon its own aeration. It has to get its oxygen from his own system, which is principally the lungs. This means the lungs have to expand. The heart has to rotate in position. There is a competition, as it were, for space. The diaphragm begins to move for the first time in a very erratic, eccentric manner at first, going up and down, the cupola rising, pushing against the lungs, which are expanding with air. The baby is now ingesting atmospheric air from the outside.
It certainly sounds like a fatiguing experience.
It's a terrific experience. He has an enormous time, and it is at this time that more than ever he needs the support that his mother was designed. I say designed, and I underscore designed, and I put it in italics, because this is not the period at which he and his mother should be severed from one another, even though the umbilical cord is cut. As a matter of fact, even before the umbilical cord is cut, they ought to be in very close relations with each other. The mother should be making the cooing sounds that she would naturally be making to him, and she should be holding him to her bosom, not through several layers of silks and linens or other symbols of conspicuous consumption, but against her skin.
Supposing she's unconscious.
Oh, but she wouldn't be unconscious if she hadn't been rendered unconscious first by lots of mystifying and frightening myths about the difficulty and the dangers of pregnancy. All this is nonsense.
I feel called upon to ask you a rather singular question, Dr. Montagu.
I imagine what that is going to be, whether I've ever had a baby. Well, I've done almost as well as that. I've been present at the delivery of a large number of babies, and even more than that, I've delivered several babies myself, and also caused quite a number of other people to deliver themselves of their babies, or have their husbands deliver them of their babies. And of course I talk to a good many people, including obstetricians, formally on the subject of this very matter that we are discussing at the present time, namely the importance of the birth process. You see, as you well know, we were really not designed by nature to wear clothes. We wear clothes because, having the kinds of intelligence that we do, we can protect ourselves.
We couldn't stand it if we didn't, our aesthetic sense.
Well, what's wrong with ours? You mean we couldn't look at each other?
I do
if
indeed.
If we weren't wearing clothes?
I do indeed.
Oh, I think that is merely...
And besides, we're not covered with fur. How do you know we weren't intended to be clothed?
We do exactly what the Eskimo does. To protect himself from the icy cold, he takes the furs of animals and makes up for the absence of fur on his own body and clothes himself with the furs. And this is perfectly sensible, of course, and highly desirable. And in hot climates, people do not wear clothes because they don't need them. And there is no necessity for them, but they don't find themselves unpleasant to look at. This is, I think, an idea which develops to the extent it has done in a highly civilized culture where we place such great emphasis upon looks.
In referring to the traumatic experience of childbirth, do you imply that there is an anxiety sown in the child, so to speak, with the experience of birth, if the birth is difficult?
Yes, this is what is generally believed. Whether the birth has been difficult in the sense of having lasted 24 or 48 hours or only 48 minutes, that the process of birth is a necessary experience because as a result of this accumulation of undischarged motor energy in relation to the incoming sensory stimulation, which is out of all proportion to the response that the child can make through its motor acts, the child becomes increasingly more anxious, and this is the birth of the original anxiety. And the function of the birth of anxiety is that you shall be anxious, and that wherever you get into a situation of difficulty and danger, that you shall become anxious, because anxiety is likely to protect you and save your life. If you weren't anxious, you'd be run over by the first automobile on the first street you attempted to cross.
And if there were not anxiety, the human race wouldn't survive, because no child would grow up if the mother were not anxious.
And no child would grow up to be an adult if it were itself not anxious.
In other words, the theory that total peace of mind, total elimination of anxiety, a panacea for every worry, which is now circulating broadly in this country, is a fairly false theory.
Yes, I would say that you cannot obtain peace of mind without the use of your mind. Now, to return to this baby, when he is born, as I've already said, he is expecting the universe to love him, particularly in the form of his mother, because they still continue in a symbiotic relationship for the simple reason that both the mother, biologically and psychologically, needs the baby as much, if not more, than the baby needs her. After all, someone else can take care of the baby, not the baby's natural or biological mother. But when more than ever he needs this mother is at birth, during the process of parturition, when he is being born, and immediately after he is born. Of course, as you've remarked, it's vastly more complicated than that, and very much more difficult for the fetus. As you know, many of them are born in a cyanotic condition, that is, blue in the face, not breathing. They have to be turned upside down and given hearty slaps on the buttocks, or caressed and massaged, or put in hot and cold water alternatively in order to resuscitate them, and mucus which is gathered in their nose and mouth sort of blown out or sucked out and whatnot. And this poor character is waiting for a continuation of the life that he has led in the womb. And what we give him is instead the dusty answer. We separate him from the mother. Why? Because our experts tell us this is what should be done. And frequently they don't see each other until some 24, even 48 hours have elapsed, and the poor mother will say, oh, when she sees her child for the first time, as I have heard with my own ears more than once, the same identical words from mothers who had never met. Hello, little stranger. Or they have said to me, you know, if I hadn't seen the baby again, I wouldn't have known that I had him, and I wouldn't have missed them. This is really quite criminal. This is to interrupt a relationship which is fundamental and illustrates from the word go how we get off onto the wrong foot. Now, what should the baby and the mother be doing immediately after birth? In the first place, the mother should not have been given any of these mystifying, frightening stories, and this way we have made some progress. Though we still frighten the mother by telling her that she has to go to a hospital to have a baby. Why should a woman have a baby in a hospital? Is pregnancy, is having a baby a disease, a disorder? Hospitals are designed to attend to abnormal and pathological conditions. Is the process of birth an abnormality, a pathological condition? And how often do emergencies arise? Emergencies are the rare exception. And yet, by sending women to a hospital, immediately we tell them that, well, this is a dangerous situation you're in. After all, why are you in a hospital? Doctors have to take care of you because something may go wrong, and it may take just a few minutes, and it's the difference between life and death.
Well, something very often has gone wrong in the history of women.
No, this is not true.
Puerperal fever used to be a very common place.
Yes, and who was responsible for puerperal fever? In the Vienna Krankenhaus, where Semmelweis, who was the man who discovered the cause of childbed fever in the middle of the last century, before, if a woman had her baby on the street, it was well known. She survived, and the baby did. But if she had it in the hospital, her chances were very, very small of surviving. And, of course, it was the doctors who brought the infections to the mothers. And Semmelweis reduced his mortality rates to 26% from 95% by simply getting the doctors and students to wash their hands in an antiseptic fluid before they examined these pregnant mothers. But, of course, the exceptional case is the one that goes wrong. These are the rare exceptions, and we can deal with these. I would make a fortune if I were asked to bet on the frequency with which anything would go wrong, because it's not a matter of 2% going wrong, it's much less than that. And in a well-conducted society, difficulty of any sort would be taken care of usually before it arose or immediately.
Well, perhaps in a well-conducted society, but you must admit that there is a difference in the capacity for easy childbirth in different women of different cultures, because in Poland, for instance, the peasant girl will go and lie down in a cow's stall and have the child and be back in the fields 2 days later. But I doubt if the women that we meet in America today could do that without dying.
Well, you'd be surprised. Lots of women have their babies at home and who read up on the subject and whose husbands read up on the subject and who had their babies. And I wish I could tell you some of the stories about these women. One of them wrote to me that when the doctor arrived, she walked out of the kitchen, having prepared the family meal for the 5 of them, including the new arrival. And in her letter she writes, "You should have seen the doctor's face. He nearly fainted."
But have you seen the child since? I mean, are those children
Well,
necessarily any more normal than the children?
Well, I don't know whether they're any more normal, but I receive reports from many of these mothers who not only have had one child this way, but several, and who would never dream of having a child in any other way. And the difference is so great between going into the impersonal, one-dimensional, emotionally, humanely arid environment of a hospital with the beautiful white tiles and white ceiling, and a woman without the sound of a voice that she's ever heard before or the touch of a hand that she is familiar with, and a nurse or an intern may pop his head into the delivery room and say, "Everything all right," and pop out again, and that's about the only contact she may have in many cases. There's a girl who then comes in and says, "What is your husband's occupation? Where do you live? What is your name?" etc. Well, this is again and again the experience. It's not a good one. But do let us return to the birth situation and importance of this. Now, supposing you have your baby at home, even supposing you had him in some hospital or in a field. And now, supposing you leave the mother with the baby in skin contact. The mother has not received any of this sedation. She hasn't been frightened to death. She's watching the whole birth process, participating. Let her husband be there. He should, of course, be there on the assumption that he's had something to do with initiating this process, at least. And if he isn't there, well, so much the worse for the situation, but at least mother and baby should not be put asunder. They're left together, and they are in contact with each other's skin. The vernix caseosa, that cheesy-looking material which covers the whole body of the baby, should not be disturbed. This is highly desirable and necessary for him, and if it is left, he will never develop any sores, any skin eruptions, and he won't need the dubious benefits of the oils with which he will be anointed. But he is left in communication with his mother's skin. Now,
without having had a bath?
He shouldn't have a bath, any more than the mother's breast that should be feeding him should have been prepared by having been washed with antiseptic lotions and whatnot, thus producing disappearance of all the normal secretions which are calculated to produce the normal healthy functioning of this area of her body. We intend with the best of goodwill to help the mother, instead of which we generally produce cracked breasts and difficulties in feeding, which makes it impossible for her to breastfeed the baby even if she wanted to. Well, now, we don't give them a bath. In fact, we take too many baths. You know why I suspect we take too many baths? Because we are trying to recollect those conditions which we spent being suspended by the umbilical cord in our mother's amniotic fluid, in which we were rocked, as it were, in the cradle of the deep thereof, and caressed by the gentle waves.
Well, that might be a reason for going swimming, but I think the reasons for the bath are clearer.
It may be for shower baths, too. At any rate, the baby, we've got him in skin contact at last with his mother. She holds him in her arms against her own body. The result of this alone is to do for her and for the baby what no one else on this earth can do. By such communication with each other, the mother conveys support to the baby. She will make the sounds that she will naturally make, but she also communicates with him through the skin. In fact, the first communication we have is of this kind, through the skin, in cutaneous contact. Now, supposing, even before the cord is cut, which means immediately after the baby is born, you put the baby to nurse at the mother's breast. A strange idea in our time, because, as everyone knows, milk doesn't come into the mother's breast until some 24 hours or more have elapsed, and there's only present this lemony, yellowish-looking fluid called colostrum, and this is some sort of luxus of nature, an unnecessary stuff. On the other hand, colostrum is the most essential of all the substances for a baby to take in. It contains a vast number of important substances, among which are the only known substances that can clear out the intestinal tract of the baby and get rid of the accumulation of cells and debris known as meconium, that greenish-looking substance which it will excrete.
And there isn't any colostrum in cow's milk, is there?
There isn't any colostrum in cow's milk. That's a different kind of milk. Cow's milk is wonderful stuff for little cows. The best stuff for little babies is human mother's milk, the very milk that is in the breast of the woman to whom this baby has just been born. These are chemically very different substances, and a baby who is nursed on his mother's milk is a very different creature chemically, as well as psychologically, from a baby that has been fed from a bottle or a plastic substitute for a soft, yielding mother's breast, at the end of which bottle there is a rubber tire, which is supposed to be a substitute for the nipple, and this baby is supposed to have the same kind of experience as the normally breastfed baby.
What is the evidence that the one child, the mother-nursed child, is so superior chemically and physically to the bottle-fed child?
Well, the evidence is in the literature of pediatrics. We know, for example, that the breastfed baby will practically never suffer from diarrhea, and that the bottle-fed baby will, and that the only known medical cure for a baby suffering from diarrhea is to breastfeed him.
Well, yes, that's a physiological evidence, but I'm speaking of the effect on the human being as such.
Breastfed baby, well, to give you one example, in the form of behavior, a study just published last year from Harvard Department of Social Relations on the relation between breastfeeding and cigarette smokers showed that there was a high correlation between the amount of breastfeeding one had experienced and the quantity of cigarettes one smoked. In other words, the less breastfeeding, the more heavier smoker one was, the more breastfed one was, the less one tended to smoke.
But does that affect one's personality?
I'm giving you that as an evidence of the expression of personality. This is a human being behaving, and he is behaving presumably because he wants the kind of oral experience that he didn't get a sufficient amount of and feels the lack of in his adult years. This is the kind of evidence we have. And there's a good deal of other evidence that throws considerable light on this being breastfed or not breastfed. For example, why is the American male such a bosom worshipper? Why do the boys on Madison Avenue, when they want to advertise anything under the sun, show a sweater girl?
Well, I thought the reasons for that were fairly obvious.
But apparently not obvious enough.
Well, the bosom has another symbol besides its usefulness to the baby. I admit that it's exaggerated in this country, but
yes, but why the bosom? Why not the nose or the ears or the eyes or the chin?
Well, I thought the bosom was a secondary sexual symbol.
Yes, it's certainly a secondary sexual symbol, but so are the curves of the body. The curves, of course, are also exhibited by those who wish to attract attention to objects, but the tremendous interest in the female bosom is something that can only be explained, it seems to me, by very, very profound emotional attachment to this object.
How then do you explain the rather notorious interest that the American male seems to feel for the female leg?
Well, gracious, the female leg is, again, a secondary sexual character because the male is being conditioned in this culture to regard a female as being made up principally of curves which are of sexual interest to him, and in fact love for the American male is the perception on his part of an object of the opposite sex possessing a certain distribution of curvilinear properties which immediately cause him phototropically, in other words, on perceiving this light impulse, to migrate automatically in her direction. This is love. And then when the curvilinear properties change their form, of course, love flies out the window.
Well, is this not true of mankind for the most part, in most cultures and most ages? In previous centuries, there were great mammalian exposés, ladies with enormous décolletage. This seems to me to be awfully irrelevant to the question of whether the child must be nursed by its mother or not.
Oh, well, when you're getting down to bustles and other forms of dress, this enters an area in which, while it may be related, is really somewhat off the main beam of what we are discussing. But I would like to return to the baby nursing its mother's breast, where he's intended to nurse. The very name, mammal, the class of animals to which we belong, derives its name from the fact that these are the animals that nurse their young from the breast. This is what mamma means, the mammary gland, the technical name for the breast. And if you put this newborn baby to nurse at his mother's breast, then he solves, by 75 million years of mammalian development, the problems that no obstetrician can anywhere nearly as easily solve, and in many cases ever solve, as well as the newborn baby can in the first 10 minutes after he's born, or a little longer. He solves the three most important, most difficult problems in the obstetrician's canon. These are, first, the postpartum hemorrhage, the bleeding, which will cease in 5 minutes. The beginning return of the womb to normal size, which it will never do in the absence of this baby sucking on his mother's breast. And 3, the third stage of labor, which is the ejection of the placenta. And this is done by the baby sucking on the mother's breast, setting up reflexes in her body. In other words, he sucks on the nipple. Sensory stimuli are immediately taken up and passed to the organs involved in the mother. And the organ particularly involved is the womb, and this begins to contract. Immediately the baby starts sucking so massively that you can see it, certainly with the naked eye, and feel it with your hand. Now this baby, without benefit of an MD degree or a diploma in obstetrics, can do for his mother by virtue of his biological endowment, and without any consciousness or awareness, of course, of what he is doing. And this also proves that in one upper and lower lip of a newborn baby, which is derived from the same embryologic ectodermal layer as the brain, there is more intelligence than in all the brains of all the obstetricians put together.
But this is the physiological nature of human nature. I would like to ask you, is the child, when it is born, complete? Are there any further chemical changes, changes in the nervous system, changes in the brain that take place after birth?
No, he's certainly not complete. He's quite incomplete, and certainly his nervous system is incomplete. A tremendous amount of growth has to occur. For example, at birth, his brain has a volume of about 350 cubic centimeters. At the end of his first year, that will have been doubled. He will have 700 cubic centimeters. This is quite a tremendous rate of growth. But this keeps up, you see, with the rate at which he is learning. At his second year, he will gain another 200 cubic centimeters, and this will bring him up to 1,000 cubic centimeters at the end of his second year. At the end of his third year, he'll gain 100, and this will be 1,100. At the end of his fourth year, he will gain 50, and this will bring him up to 1,150. At the end of his fifth year, he will gain another 50. This will bring him up to 1,200. And at the end of his sixth year, he will have gained about 30 more, and this will bring him up to 1,230 cubic centimeters. And the volume of the adult brain is virtually achieved by the end of his sixth year. As an adult, he will have about 1,350 cc. So he's only got about 120 more cc to go between the age of 6 years and 21, when he will achieve his final brain weight. And this is interesting because, you see, the first 6 years, the major part of brain growth is achieved. And this is the period which is parallel with the maximum learning period. But in this period, there are going to be quite a large number of changes in his very brain structure.
New tissue?
Oh, cells and neurons will grow. You know what a neuron is. Cell, a nerve cell, at which one end there's the input system, the sensory part, called the dendrite, which enters the cell, produces the biochemical and electrical changes in it, which then go out through the motor part, which goes forward, you see, to an end organ, but generally hitches up with another neurons, dendrites, which then go into the cell of that neuron, and then into the motor part, the axon, and so on, in quite a chain, until the end organ is reached, you see. Now, each of these axons may grow collateral little nervelets, and these little collaterals will hitch up with other collaterals, and thus form an extensive network, depending upon the kind of experience one has undergone.
It is then a question of the individual, how those neurons develop and what adds on. I mean, it varies with each person, so that it has an effect on the personality, in a way, continues to determine the character.
Oh, yes. For example, you were born with eyes, but you would never learn to see if you weren't educated to see. For example, you would never hear properly if you didn't learn to hear. You have to learn to hear. You have to learn to see in precisely the same way as you learn to walk and learn to talk. You know, it takes about 2 years to learn how to talk and about 70 how to keep your mouth shut. Well, you see, this is part of the process of acquiring wisdom. The child has, within his first 6 years, to acquire the foundations upon which his wisdom will later be erected. But this is a little off the subject. I want to get back still to the mother and baby in cutaneous contact. You see, one of the things that we have forgotten about the cutaneous importance of communication is that we communicate with each other from the skin. You know very well that there are human beings who don't like to be touched. The better you have been brought up, in quotes, the more likely it is that you will apologize to someone whom you have accidentally touched, even if it's a member of your own family. You would certainly not lean upon a stranger, as a Frenchman does, without thinking twice about it and certainly apologizing about it, are a culture that have neglected the importance of communication through the skin. We need to caress babies. We need to give them a lot of cutaneous stimulation. This is physiologically important for them. For example, we know that cats and dogs won't ever develop properly, and in fact will die if their mothers do not lick them. We all say, oh, what a pretty sight. You see, the mother is washing her little kittens. Well, whether it be a little foal or whether it be a puppy or the little kittens is irrelevant. And it isn't washing at all. I am on more than bowing acquaintance with numerous cats, and I know very well that they haven't the least idea of cleaning up their babies. What they're doing is naturally responding to odor, principally, and subsequently to taste when they lick these infants instinctively, and they lick them because if they didn't lick them, the babies, the little kittens, would die. They would die from failure of their gastrointestinal and their genitourinary tracts to function.
But you're extrapolating, therefore, from what we know about animals to
Yes,
the baby.
the extrapolation is extremely important. You see, what is biologically very widespread in a class of animals is likely to be physiologically fundamental for all of them. And while mothers do not have to lick their young, they can, on the other hand, dispense with the licking because the contractions of the uterus produce such a massive stimulation of the skin of the baby before it is born that it is thereby prepared for its immediate functioning after birth. And this is why, when a baby isn't breathing, you see, you hold him upside down by his legs and give him some hearty spanks on the buttocks, or you caress him, massage him, in order to stimulate his nervous system to start functioning, particularly his respiratory tract. You help him along by stimulating his skin. The skin is the largest organ in the body, and yet it's the organ we most overlook, proving once again the principle that what is nearest our noses is the thing we are most likely to overlook. We need to give babies a tremendous amount of cutaneous stimulation, not to lick them, but to caress them a great deal.
But there must be something mental that should accompany all this for the human being, no?
Oh, yes, but of course what is mental that goes on in a baby we can only observe.
But that goes on in a mother.
But that goes on the mother is quite clear. Anyone who has ever observed Grantley Dick Reed's films showing poor mothers having their own babies by natural childbirth, or in the absence of this film, simply observe the process of childbirth under as natural conditions as possible, where the mother has not been knocked out by artificial sedations, by poisons introduced into her system which cut off the oxygen both from her and from the fetus when it most needs it, thus killing large numbers of fetuses, or if not killing them, making idiots or imbeciles of them, or making them much less bright than they otherwise would do, because at this critical period the oxygen is very low in the baby's brain, and any withdrawal of oxygen for even a few minutes may do very substantial harm by killing large numbers of cells in its brain, and there they will remain dead for the rest of its life, and the child's mentality affected to a greater or lesser degree if it survives.
You would then say that human birth is the most critical moment in the life of the individual?
I certainly would, yes, very definitely. In addition to being the most critical period in the life of the individual, it is also a very critical period in the life of the mother, because a mother will not be the same woman as she would have been had she undergone this natural experience. If she omits any part of this experience, the witnessing of the baby's birth, the nursing of the baby, and being together with the baby from the moment of birth and for a considerable period of time thereafter, she herself will not develop as the kind of woman she would have been, a kind of person who is very much related to what is going on in the world of humanity. And there are some European obstetricians who have told me that by looking at a woman, they can tell whether she has nursed her baby adequately or not.
Well, are you saying that this will affect her so-called maternal instinct for the rest of her life as a mother, or affect her whole personality?
No, I'm saying that it will affect her development as a human being, as a personality. She will not be as well-rounded and as full-rounded a person as she would have been had she nursed her baby as she ought to do. And I would say that liberty, in this as in all other connections, consists not, as Lord Acton, the Catholic English historian, pointed out, Liberty does not consist in the freedom to do what you like or to pay uncritical attention to authorities, but in the right to be able to do what you ought. And what you ought to do, it is your moral obligation to discover for yourself.
That's an unquestionably moral conclusion, Dr. Montagu, although one that is not exactly easy to put into practice. All the way through our conversations, your theme song has been our capacity for love. So the next discussion will lead us, I take it, right into the heart of the matter, into the nature of love itself.